Welcome to the Jedburgh podcast. I'm the creator and host, Fran Racioppi. Each episode, I speak with transformative leaders, visionaries, drivers of change, and those dedicated to winning no matter the challenge. The Jedburgh podcast is founded in the lineage of the special operations Jedburgh teams of the past and is produced in partnership with Talent War Group, a management consulting and executive search firm focused on helping you optimize the people side of your business. We're sponsored by Jersey Mike Subs. Together, we share the mission of giving, making a difference in someone's life. Visit the Jedburgh Podcast, Talent War Group, and Jersey Mike Subs on the web and on all social media. A percentage of all proceeds is dedicated to the Green Beret Foundation, supporting America's Special Forces and their families.
You are very rarely responding to a disaster completely on your own. There is not a single hero in a disaster like Hollywood portrays. People coming together and working together, identifying a need in the community, working with the resources they can pull together to address that need. You're more likely to be rescued in an earthquake by your neighbors, for example, rather than formal, trained first responders.
The world is seemingly ripe with disasters in every corner of the globe. They also seem to be getting worse. Hurricanes are stronger and more frequent. Winter storms are colder and more powerful. The summer's hotter and drier. Wildfires rage. Floods consume entire cities and towns. Sometimes these events happen in succession. Other times, they happen all at once. In all cases, response and recovery efforts are going to be needed, and they're going to be constrained. But why is this happening? And who's going to lead in these times of chaos and confusion? For this episode, I sat down with Dr. Samantha Montano, a self-proclaimed disasterologist and the author of Disasterology, Dispatches from the Front Lines of Climate Crisis. Samantha holds a PhD in emergency management and is an assistant professor of emergency management at Massachusetts Maritime Academy. We break down the hazard event scale, explaining what takes an event from an emergency to a disaster to a catastrophe. We also talk about the driving factors behind the increase in catastrophic events. Climate change is real, and the climate status quo is changing. But in this conversation, we spend time chasing down the consequences of climate change, the effects of our socio-economic policy, decaying infrastructure, lack of policy, and population movement. Samantha also defines preparedness in her terms. We spend a lot of time in emergency management discussing individual go bags, survival kits, but disasters are often made and recovered from by groups and by policy decisions. Samantha shares what it takes to be a successful emergency manager, which government organizations are getting it right, and where we need more leadership with the courage to actually take action. And if you think you know a lot about disasters, stay tuned for our lightning round at the end, where I challenge Samantha to give me the pros and cons of some of the most impactful events our nation has ever seen. Listen to my conversation with Samantha on your favorite podcast platforms. Watch the full video version of our discussion on YouTube. Subscribe to us and follow at Jedburgh Podcast on all social media. Check out our website, jedburghpodcast.com. Learn more about Samantha at disaster-ology.com and on Twitter and Instagram at SamLMontano. Samantha, welcome to the Jedburgh Podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
We live in this complex world that brings chaos and confusion at seemingly every turn. As individuals, as a society, we often don't get to choose. We never really get to choose the timing of catastrophic events, the frequency, the duration. Sometimes we face them in series. Sometimes we face them in serial, and sometimes we face them all at once simultaneously. We had a pandemic, but we didn't get to then say, well, we're not going to have any natural disasters. We're not going to have terrorism threats. All these other things aren't going to happen just because we have a pandemic. To effectively manage and lead through crisis and emergency, we look to emergency managers. Sometimes, like in your case, they're trained professionals. Other times, and most often, emergency managers tend to be people who, from our conversation with Eric McNulty on episode 70, you're it. You're the person who's in the role, and the disaster comes, the catastrophe comes, and all of a sudden you're in charge and everyone's looking to you, or the phone rings in the night and someone has said you're the person who needs to respond and you have to jump in and you have to do it. You come from a long line of emergency managers. Your grandfather was one of the country's first emergency managers in World War II. You hold a PhD in emergency management. You volunteered in response and recovery to a number of natural disasters. You're an assistant professor of emergency management at the Massachusetts Maritime Academy, and you're the author of Disasterology, Dispatches from the Front Lines of Climate Crisis. I told you I read it. I thought it was great. We're going to get all about it. We're going to talk about climate change, preparedness, disaster justice, and we're going to do a lightning round on when we got it right and when we got it wrong, when I'm going to throw out a bunch of disasters and you're going to tell me what we did right and what we did wrong. I appreciate you taking the time to join me. But before we get into it, I have to ask you, what is a disasterologist? And can you define disasterology?
I can. So, a disasterologist is anybody who studies disasters. So, there are all different kinds of disciplines that are interested in disasters and that are doing disaster research: historians, economists, psychologists, sociologists. And so, kind of the overarching field that we're all working within is what I would term disasterology. Myself, I'm working within the discipline of emergency management. So I'm mostly focused on what we can do to prevent disasters, prepare for them, how we respond to them, and how we recover to them.
Well, you didn't always want to be in emergency management. So I have to ask you what drew you into it.
Yeah, so I got started doing disaster work in New Orleans after Katrina and the levee failure. I grew up in Maine on the East Coast, and
Which is way
I,
different than Louisiana.
yes, very different. Yeah, but when Katrina happened, I was in high school. I had a very basic understanding of what hurricanes were and what levees were. And so I watched it unfold on TV, but I was very, very far removed from what was happening. But I had the opportunity to go and volunteer for a week with my high school, just, helping gut homes, rebuild homes. And pretty much as soon as I got there, I realized just the full extent of need that existed in the city, right? There were all of these people that were coming into New Orleans to help, but it still wasn't enough. And so I ended up moving to New Orleans, and I lived there for 4 years, working with all different kinds of recovery nonprofits, doing kind of anything and everything that needed to be done throughout the city. And yeah, that's how this all started.
Well, let me ask you about the difference between disaster and catastrophe, because you kind of open the book with a bit of this conversation. You talk and you say, quote, catastrophes are not just big disasters. They're something different, something more complicated, unquote. What is the difference, in your opinion, between a disaster and a catastrophe?
Yeah, so this idea originates with some of the founders of disaster sociology. So they're looking at these kind of different events that occur and whether or not an emergency, like a car accident that happens in your town, is the same as, something like Hurricane Katrina and the levee failure, right? And obviously, when we hold those two examples up, we say, no, these are different. And yet you see emergency management involved in both of those different types of events. And so in the process of kind of working through what these different categories look like, the model that we use is what we would call the hazard event scale. So you have emergencies on the low end, disasters in the middle, and catastrophes on the high end. And what you're doing there is not just looking in terms of impacts and the needs that are associated with that event, which obviously kind of go up in scale, but you're also looking at who is responding and how they are going about that response. So, what is the actual approach to managing these events? And when you do that, you see that with emergencies, you're using mostly local resources. You're relying on your local first responders. Maybe the neighboring town comes to help out, but it's really handled locally. It's handled within your existing plans, the existing trainings that those agencies are doing on a day-to-day basis. When you get to disasters, we have disaster plans, and most of the time they're pretty okay in the US. They meet most of the needs that we have during a disaster, although certainly you still see gaps and issues in those responses. But then when we get to catastrophic events, that's where you see this complete breakdown in the emergency management system, in how politicians are responding, in kind of what leadership looks like in these events. And they become this entirely different type of event. And the reason this is important is because the way you plan for an emergency is going to look very different than the way you plan for a disaster, which is going to look different than the way you plan for catastrophes. And in the US, we have we do really well with emergencies for the most part locally. We've built, out that infrastructure and out that system, and we do okay with disasters. But when we get to these catastrophic events, that's really where you see these complete breakdowns, and you see, higher numbers of death, and you see really just this complete breakdown in the system.
Do you think, because I wanted to ask you about leadership when it comes to, and you went there when it comes to emergency versus disaster versus catastrophe, do you think that a disaster becomes a catastrophe or could elevate because of a failure of leadership, or is it because of the actual conditions, the event that happened?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely do think it is a combination of both. I do think that the failure of leadership has the ability to kind of start bumping something into a different category. And I think you see this. I think Katrina actually is a good example of this, right? In that framing, we would call Katrina a catastrophe in the US context. And when you look back at leadership at all levels of government and among various agencies, you really see that, lack of communication, lack of coordination, that breakdown and that absence of really strong leadership during the actual response. I always say kind of when General Russell Honore showed up, that was when we saw leadership coming from government kind of for the first time in that event. At the same time, that's leadership kind of within government. Certainly, there's leadership among the community and among people who are impacted that manifests on kind of a smaller scale. But in thinking of leadership in terms of who is actually leading a response.
I want to talk about climate change because because so many times when we talk about emergencies, disasters, catastrophes, we are speaking in terms of natural disasters. And you spend a lot of time in the book talking about climate change, the effects of climate change. And you said that there are two separate but related factors to climate change. And the first one is that we all understand that we have to cut emissions to further prevent changes to the climate. I'm not even going to sit here and argue differently with you with that. I mean, I think that's a fact. The world's getting warmer. Weather patterns are shifting. We're operating in more of the extremes. It's colder. It's colder than it used to be. It's warmer than it used to be in the summer. There's powerful, more intense storms. You talk about the urban heat island that's created in these cities, which I think is fascinating. But in reality, the status quo is evolving, and we have to start to figure out how are we also going to evolve. But the second part of this, the second factor, is what I truly enjoyed. And you talked about the consequences of climate change. You didn't focus on the tactical level numbers and throw a lot of stats by 2020 it's going to be this hot, and 2022 it's going to be this hot. You didn't tell people to stop using electricity or grow their own food or, buy solar cars. You tied climate change into the socioeconomic and the societal changes we face as a nation and as communities. You focused on the complexity that's caused by our decisions, human nature, and actions, and all of these decisions are exacerbated in these times of emergency, disaster, and catastrophe by climate change events. I'm going to read a quote. It's a little bit long, and then I'm going to ask you about it. You said, "Climate change is so insidious because it intertwines itself with our existing vulnerabilities and amplifies them. It further threatens what is already fragile and at risk. It takes these hazards that we've always had to manage, hurricanes, flooding, landslides, wildfires, and changes the way they manifest. These changes interacting with other factors like population movement towards high-risk areas, poorly written and enforced regulations, societal and economic inequality, decaying infrastructure, and poor development decisions create our risk. In other words, climate change paired with these demographic, regulatory, and policy factors are literally a recipe for disaster." Why is it a recipe for disaster? How do all those things come together?
Well, look, there are all of these different factors, right? As I outlined in that quote, and they're all kind of coming to a head right now, right? We have, for decades and in some case centuries, written policies and made decisions at, again, all levels of government that have been made without thinking about the future, right? And without thinking about our safety in the future and our ability to continue to live where we live and how we live in the future. And so what we have begun to see in recent years are all of these decisions manifesting in turmoil, frankly, across the country, right? If you just take infrastructure as one kind of really like concrete
Mhm.
example here, right? Right, we're all on the same page, right? We have not maintained our infrastructure across the country just in terms of basic maintenance, let alone making changes to that infrastructure to retrofit it to deal with the changing hazards that we've begun to see with climate change. That fact alone is creating a tremendous amount of risk. If you look at development decisions, right, we've just seen this, unfortunately, in Florida with Hurricane Ian. Houston is always the other example. We have built entire neighborhoods, entire cities in dangerous places, and we've built them in ways that are dangerous. We have not accounted for flooding, for these other hazards that we know those places experience. And so, there are consequences to those decisions that have been made again over a really long time. And unfortunately, now we're at a point of needing to deal with those consequences across the country.
When we look at the decisions that we talk about, you talked about infrastructure, the green dot map comes to mind. And, can you talk about the effect of something like the green dot map on the psyche of a populace?
Yeah, so the green dot map, for folks that aren't familiar, was or is a reference to a recovery plan that was created for New Orleans after Katrina. And there was a version of a map of the city that was shared at one point that had, big green circles over certain neighborhoods. And the implication was that those neighborhoods were not going to be rebuilt, that those were going to be turned into green space with the stated purpose of helping with future flooding, right? To use that land to help absorb water, et cetera. And of course, when you go to rebuild after a disaster, we absolutely want to see that folks are implementing mitigation into their recovery, right? Making changes to their community to prevent that same disaster from happening again in the future. However, at the same time, when that map came out, right, and you are somebody who lives in that neighborhood, one, you have just been through an incredibly traumatic event. You are probably still displaced. Maybe you've been able to come back to the city, but things are tough. You are trying to navigate an incredibly complex recovery process, and you are being told by the city, we're all united. We're all going to come back together. We're one city. And then you see this map that says, well, actually, no, you don't get to live here anymore.
Right.
No, your neighborhood isn't as important as the neighborhood next to yours. And that is, it's incredibly isolating. It's incredibly painful, right? It's in some ways feeling like your neighbors, your community has turned their back on you. So certainly that is kind of a really strong example of how these decisions that we make, whether it's before, during, or after a disaster, can have these huge consequences on how people feel about their community and what the future looks like in their community.
We often think about disasters and emergencies, catastrophes, what you will, events I mentioned in the beginning that we always think about them a lot, that they happen in succession, one at a time. But, you talk a lot about the fact that disasters don't hit us one at a time, and they don't wait in a line until the preceding disaster has ended. And what happens when we have these multiple disasters or these events happening at any one time is our resources begin to become constrained because they're devoted to other things. And so many times when we talk about disaster response, we leverage those within our community. And as you mentioned a few minutes ago, we also look to our neighbor, the towns and the cities and the states next door. But what happens when they're consumed with their own disaster, their own events? You spoke about the federal versus state responses and the fact that you called climate change a threat multiplier. What happens when we are in these situations where you have a city, you have a state, you have an area that encounters a disaster, but there is no help. There is no one else to look to.
Yeah, look, I think there's kind of been two recent examples of this in the US. So the first was in 2017, the 2017 hurricane season. We had Harvey in Texas, immediately followed by Irma in Florida and Maria in Puerto Rico. And we also had wildfires going on the West Coast at the same time. And this was, I think, a really poignant example of seeing what can happen to the emergency management system when there is so much need simultaneously across the country. The way that our emergency management system has been designed, so local, state, and federal all being a part of that system, is that you start with the local government. Once they're overwhelmed, you turn to the state. Then once they're overwhelmed, you turn to the federal government. And the problem with that approach is that when you have multiple parts of the country that are all simultaneously in need, resources are strained, right? We are used to kind of having a disaster happen in one geographic location, us sending all of our resources there.
Mm-hmm.
Next disaster happens, and you send them all there, right? And so we're able to kind of get by with, in some ways, surprisingly few resources nationally. And 2017 was when we saw, oh, that is not going to work, right? When you have this many events. And part of the reason that you see such a failed response in Puerto Rico, leading to such a high death toll in Puerto Rico as compared to the other states, is because resources were strained, right? That wasn't the only reason, but it was an important one. When you look back at the GAO reports, looking at FEMA, right, you see that they were strained, they were kind of running out of employees, they had employees in positions that they weren't really trained to be in, the contracts that they had with businesses for like providing food were running out. And so that contributes to this kind of failed response you see in Puerto Rico. The second time that we've seen this was during COVID, and particularly at the start of COVID. You have, forgive me for using this overused word at this point, but an unprecedented situation across the country where every single emergency management agency at every level activates essentially simultaneously. And, you know, that reliance that you normally have on your neighboring jurisdictions from the state all of a sudden becomes much less clear, much less reliable. And certainly, you know, people were kind of helping each other where we could, but it was a situation where everybody was really kind of focused on the response happening in their own community.
Mm-hmm. And when, in the case of COVID, you know, often people were more concerned about the response of themselves versus, you know, others, because you have a situation where, you know, disaster requires people often to come together. And now COVID introduces this piece of like, well, we're not, you know, how do we come together?
Yes, there were definitely added logistical challenges of moving emergency operation centers all online and figuring out how to approach that piece of it.
You said you make a distinction between these large events, you know, Maria, Katrina, Irma, and, you know, Harvey, large scale disasters, Hurricane Sandy, versus the smaller repetitive floods. If we think about the flooding that occurred in the Carolinas through the, you know, 2014 to 2018, 2019, that time period. When you have these, or the tornadoes in the Midwest, when you have these consistent series of smaller events that aren't catastrophic per se, but they cause damage, they're continuously happening. You have these assets that you continuously have to deploy at some capacity in order to respond and recover. Over time, how do those small events degrade the system?
Yeah, it's tough. I think that different communities can respond in different ways, or we see kind of community outcomes look different from place to place. But generally, these smaller events can be really difficult to respond to. They are at the local level a serious event, right? There are a number of unmet needs. People need, help rebuilding their homes. There's lost jobs, there's an impact to the economy, whatever the case may be, but it's not big enough to capture any kind of national attention, which means it's probably not big enough to get help from any of like the national disaster nonprofits. That means that there probably isn't going to be any kind of serious fundraising or donations coming into that community. And it may not even be big enough for that locality to apply for and receive federal assistance through FEMA. And that leaves you with very few options. If you have impacts that aren't covered by insurance and you don't have a community that is independently wealthy, there aren't a lot of options. And over time, when you have, just one of those events, but you can have multiple of those events, and that adds up. And sometimes I think you see communities where folks start to move away, right? And you start to see that community start to kind of break apart or change in really significant ways. And then other times, I think it can almost have the opposite effect. Sometimes you see people really dig their heels in, come together. There's a lot of community organizing. People work together to try and find these more creative solutions and try to navigate around the various grant programs that might be available to them. And so, I think oftentimes those are the events that are overlooked because they are small, they don't make national news, and we, focus on these larger events, as you said, which are obviously important. But I think especially as we start contending with climate change, when we say there's going to be an increase in disasters, we're not only talking about an increase in disasters and catastrophes, we're also talking about an increase in those emergency size events. And in the same way that our system can become strained when dealing with large scale disasters and catastrophes, that strain that we put on our local systems in dealing with emergencies starts bumping things up into that disaster category, which can, again, kind of has this domino effect on the whole system.
So the tagline of the podcast is how you prepare today determines success tomorrow. We talk about it in terms of leadership. We talk about it in terms of how do we get ourselves as individuals, our teams, our organization, the most mentally, physically, emotionally prepared in order to lead and lead through the good times and the bad times. I want to define preparedness in your terms, though, and what does it actually mean to be prepared when we talk about climate change, when we talk about emergencies, disasters, catastrophes? So many times in this world of emergency management, we get told we have to have go bags. We talk about stockpiling food. We talk about having water, gas for our vehicles, and very tactically, what are we going to do when the hurricane comes or the tornado or the power outage? You've really taken, though, a more macro approach at this conversation. And really, how do we look at this strategically? How do we look at the ability and our ability to proactively prepare ourselves to minimize the disaster impacts? You talk about social networks. You talk about connection and access to technology that can provide warnings and communications, and also our physical and mental ability to adapt and persevere through these situations and these scenarios. Another thing that you said that I think was quite funny is you said, I don't need a survival kit because I have a purse. And so I want to ask you first about why is that? Why does the purse replace the survival kit? But also, why is preparedness so much more than kits?
Sure. I'll address the purse issue first. So, when you go down the kind of like standard list that the Red Cross or FEMA has about what you should stockpile in your home, it's like you should have food and water and medication and first aid and, your family's contact numbers and those kind of very basic things. And again, of course, yes, we should all have those at home. But anybody who's listening who carries a purse will tell you, like, you have most of those things in your bag on a daily basis, just as like a human being trying to navigate the world. And yeah, it's not like 3 days of supply of like food and water in your bag, but it's like there's granola bars in there. Like you can get by, it's fine. And so I think that one, when we're like conceptualizing what individual preparedness looks like, we need to take a much broader approach, right? And also recognize that many of us are already kind of going through day to day life with those items, and that we need to just have this like broader understanding of what this looks like. And so again, all of those traditional preparedness tasks are good things to do, but when you look at how people respond to disasters. One of the most consistent disaster findings we have from research is that people come together when disasters happen. You are very rarely responding to a disaster completely on your own, right? There is not a single hero in a disaster like Hollywood portrays. It's people coming together and working together, identifying a need in the community, working with the resources they can pull together to address that need. You're more likely to be rescued in an earthquake by your neighbors, for example, rather than formal trained first responders, because those are the people who know you. They know that you are home, they know where you would have been in your house, they can get to you more quickly. And so when we think about what we need to do to prepare, what we need to actually do to survive a response and move through that recovery, it's really much more about our networks and our connections that we have with the people in our communities, with our family. And that portrayal from research runs very counter to this individualistic approach that we have so often taken in emergency management. And so I would argue, as we are thinking hopefully more about preparedness in the context of climate change, that yeah, we do what we can at the individual level, but that we think much more at an organizational level, at a community level, and at a systems level. Again, when we talk about preparedness, we're talking about the individual. Well, what about preparing the emergency management
Yeah.
system? That was where we lost capacity in 2017 during COVID. It was much less what was happening at the individual level.
You talk about this shift from the individual mentality to the collective. We're going to talk about some government organizations and the groups that come together in terms of volunteers that descend upon these situations. But in times of stress, chaos, emotion, human behavior is actually to go inward. And what we need in emergency management from our leaders is the ability for them to go outward, for them to go out, find answers, interact with people, be charismatic, understand the problem as it exists, and not necessarily be subsumed with themselves or the very tactical level solutions that may come to bear. We talk in special operations and a lot on the podcast about the characteristics of performance that define elite organizations: drive, resiliency, adaptability, humility, integrity, curiosity, team ability, effective intelligence, and emotional strength. And these 9 are exhibited in so many ways when we talk about emergency management and disaster response. What characteristics are you looking for when you are seeking out to train and develop emergency managers? And I can ask you this question because you're teaching it now.
Yes. The first thing that always comes to mind for me is finding people who have a vision for emergency management. I think this is something we're really lacking in our field. I think that for a lot of reasons, we have this very kind of operational, like nose to the ground mindset in emergency management, and that can serve us well, I think, during an actual response. But for the rest of the time that you're doing your job, you need somebody who has a vision and who isn't just checking boxes. This is a huge problem for us in emergency management. You kind of copy and paste the old response plan into a new document, put the new year on it and call it good, check that box. That is not doing anyone any favors, right? We need people who have a vision, right? Emergency management as a profession is changing right now. We're kind of being forced to change, whether we like it or not. And I think anybody who kind of comes into this profession right now who is really passionate about the field and can articulate a clear vision for the path forward are people that I'd like to see in leadership positions. The second really big one for me are people who are respectful. Respectful of colleagues, but also respectful of the communities that they serve. I think respect is really at the kind of core and the foundation of building trust with a community, which is what emergency managers have to rely on when you're standing there, 24 hours before a hurricane, telling everybody news that they don't want to hear. So vision and respect are kind of the two big ones for me.
Do you have an example of someone who's a mentor who's done it right?
Ooh. God.
I could ask you about one who's done it wrong.
Yeah, I have lots who've done it wrong. No, I mean, I don't.
They don't have to be perfect.
Have a single. Yeah, no, I don't necessarily have a single person. I will say that there are a lot of really
local
amazing
emergency
managers across the country who are, working in these really small agencies and really small communities who don't have the resources that they need to keep their communities safe, but are still kind of doing everything that they can to move forward. I think a lot of them are really at the beginning stages of developing a vision for what the field looks like in the future and kind of working on figuring out how to get that vision implemented.
Let's talk about the role of emergency management and disaster response organizations. The most common name we hear is FEMA. You talk a lot about them, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, established in 1979, responsible for all phases of emergency management: mitigation, response, recovery, preparedness. They used to have a direct line to the president as a cabinet position, and then post 9/11, with the reorganization of a lot of the agencies and the establishment of Department of Homeland Security, FEMA was moved under DHS along with the Coast Guard and the Secret Service, removing that direct line to the president that you believe and talk to being quite vital. Something that this change, you said, created whiplash amongst emergency managers. You've been critical of FEMA under DHS and believe that much of the chaos in emergency management has been caused because of this realignment. Can you talk about this? Why has the alignment under DHS created that, and why do you believe it is so important for FEMA to have that direct line to the president?
Yeah, so I think there's kind of three major things going on. One, you have this direct line to the president issue. There is kind of currently you see Deanne Criswell, the FEMA administrator, seemingly working very closely with President Biden in the White House. But there is still that added layer between them, right, of the DHS secretary. When you look back to the Trump administration, you saw that there was fighting between disagreements between the head of DHS and Brock Long when he was the head of FEMA in the midst of Hurricane Florence. And so you see that real potential there. Certainly we saw it during Katrina of kind of this added layer of bureaucracy that you have to navigate in the middle of a response. And that is kind of like emergency management 101. You want as little bureaucracy and kind of people between you and the resources that you need. So that's one issue. A second issue is this demotion from being a cabinet level agency that I think sometimes can get overlooked. Prior to 9/11, FEMA was, the head of FEMA was sitting in cabinet meetings. They had a seat at the table. They had, the opportunity, more of an opportunity to build these one-on-one relationships with the other members of the cabinet who they have to call on when disasters happen, and who they have to seek buy-in from before and after disasters as well. And they were seen, I think, at the time much more as an equal than they are now as just one of many agencies within DHS. And then the third issue that you see here is a confusion of missions, right? So DHS is focused on terrorism, right? And that is certainly of a concern to emergency managers, and one of the types of hazards that we want to be preparing for and dealing with when it happens. But that is only one very small piece of what FEMA is needing to prepare the country for on a daily basis. And when you look at how budgets are tilted in terms of terrorism versus all the other hazards we're dealing with, you start to see where the priorities are when you're working within an agency in DHS. And you also see an opportunity for DHS to step in and redirect things that are happening within FEMA. You see the potential for redirecting parts of FEMA's budget, which can all have negative implications across the phases of emergency management.
Well, let's talk about the other hand, because you've talked also a lot about the Red Cross and the importance of the Red Cross and its importance in emergency management. Where does the Red Cross get it right, and why are they different organizationally from a government entity like FEMA?
Yeah, well, I broaden it. It's not necessarily the Red Cross specifically that's really important. It's disaster nonprofits, right? So any nonprofit that has a disaster specific mission. There's approximately 80 national disaster organizations, generally we say, and then there are many more that are kind of operating at a more local level in the US. And nonprofits bring a really important element of being able to kind of navigate complicated situations and not be as tied to bureaucracy as government is. They're able to be more flexible, which we often need during responses. Especially the small local nonprofits are incredibly important to disaster response and recovery. They are the community, or they are the organizations that are working in those communities day to day. They have immense local knowledge that can influence the work that they're doing during response and recovery, make them really able to quickly identify the needs of their community and find the resources to address them. So really, if you want to kind of take the nonprofit sector as a whole, they're this vital piece of our overall emergency management system, which was by design, by the way, right? Our emergency management system intentionally is designed for government to be limited in how involved they are, particularly in individual and household recovery. And it is, again, by design that the nonprofit sector is supposed to kind of be filling that gap between what people can afford, what government's providing, and what they actually need in the aftermath of disasters.
How do you balance and manage the mass assault, the descendants of all of these organizations that come into a disaster area? I mean, we've seen it you see it in hurricanes. You saw it, in Hurricane Ian. We hear about the Cajun Navy, bringing the boats in, but we've also seen it in, massive geopolitical events. I mean, we had Scott Mann on a few weeks ago on episode 77, and he ran Operation Pineapple Express, was a volunteer organization pulling people into Hamid Karzai International Airport and pulling Afghans out of Afghanistan, in the well, I won't get into the retrograde or whatever you want to call it, but I mean, we see this a lot where, there's all of these organizations that go in, everybody has good intentions, everybody wants to help. If you're there as the emergency manager, how do you now balance this desire to help? That's what I'll call it.
Yeah, it can be tough, right? So we see this with just about every disaster. There's this convergence of people who want to help, and it's been described as one disaster researcher as being a mass assault on the community, right? You have all of these people, oftentimes thousands, if not more, people showing up to a community that is literally in pieces, and who are there with good intentions, right? These are people who want to help, they want to volunteer. And from an emergency management perspective, on the one hand, we really need them to be there. We do not have enough people who can address all of the needs in that community. We need volunteers to be involved in every single aspect of response and recovery. At the same time, how do you manage all of these people? And how do you set up a system for managing them really, really quickly? This is something that in the aftermath of Katrina, there was some thinking and some major efforts kind of put into in terms of helping communities create plans for volunteer management ahead of time, thinking about how to set up what we call volunteer reception centers. So how can you kind of funnel all of these spontaneous volunteers to one location in your community and then kind of sort them out there and send them off to do various tasks. And again, kind of depending on the situation, sometimes those volunteer reception centers work really well and you can really kind of effectively spread out that spontaneous volunteer labor. Other times it can be very overwhelming for a community. But generally the thinking is kind of the more planning you've done ahead of time, and the more resources you have set aside locally to be able to manage that, then the better off the community will be.
You said, quote, "There's no single policy, no magic amount of money, no perfect plan that's going to meet the needs of communities across the country. It's much more complicated than that. Our failure to meet the needs of these communities requires no less than a movement for disaster justice." What's disaster justice?
Yeah, so I think about disaster justice as thinking about what changes are needed in our community, in our society, to create safe communities. And by that, I mean, how can we be doing more effective and efficient emergency management, right? How can we make sure that when disasters do happen, we're not seeing these disparities in impacts between communities of different classes and races? How can we make sure that we are creating an emergency management system that does not just distribute aid equally to everybody, but actually disperses aid in an equitable way, right? Giving people what they need to get back to where they are, or even better, get back to someplace even better than they were before the disaster, right? How can we go about making these longer term investments in our community that are not as short sighted as we have done in the past?
Is whose role is that? Is it government's role? I mean, who has to step up and do that?
I actually think it is everybody, really. And again, that's because of how our emergency management system is designed, right? Government is one piece of it. It's a very important piece, but nonprofits have a role to play. The private sector has a role to play. And certainly as individuals, we have a role to play as well. I do think the kind of obvious starting point perhaps is government, because I think we have some clear ways of organizing and, addressing some of the low hanging policy fruit, let's say. And I think that also what government does before, during, and after disaster signals and dictates a lot of what nonprofits and businesses and individuals do.
Well, we have to take action. And you've given some concrete steps for what action might look like. And I thought you summed it up well. And you said that, making the perfect preparedness kit and volunteering post disaster isn't going to be what keeps us safe. You've mentioned that we have to educate ourselves, we have to organize, and we have to take action. And you've put a couple of different steps within take action. But you've also said something very interesting around this idea that we have to do something. And you said that it's not about hope and that you don't go looking for hope anymore, that you have to have courage. And we've talked a lot about courage and the willingness to act on this podcast. I mentioned before we started that we did a conversation, I think it was episode 15, with Colin Bevan, who is an environmentalist, a social activist. He was the no impact man who lived in his apartment in New York City for a year on a completely carbon neutral footprint. And he talks about these limiting beliefs, and he lays out the fact that there's really three limiting beliefs. One, that people don't think that they can actually individually make a change, that it's just an uphill battle. Nobody's going to listen to them. The second one is that it's the role of government and corporations and the political parties to actually go do these things and tell people what to do. And it can't be a ground up function to drive change. And then this third one, that, it's all just going to be okay. And one day somebody's going to figure it out, and it might not be today, but eventually somebody's going to come and say, if we all do these things, and everybody will like the idea, and then all of a sudden we're going to do it, and there's going to be this monumental change within society. But the reality is it's going to be none of those things. The reality is that we as individuals have to stand up and say, look, I may not make a change in the world and in society today, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not in a year, but if I take one step and I do it first for myself, and I demonstrate that it can be done, and I have the courage to act, will other people jump on board? Can you talk about why you have thrown out this idea of hoping for the best, and you've now focused your effort on having the courage to act? Why have you thrown out this concept of hope and focused on having the courage to act?
Well, I think for me, I just have a hard time finding hope in a lot of this work, right? This is not oftentimes uplifting work that I'm doing on a daily basis. And I think that if I have limited hours in a day, right? And if I spend all my time trying to search for hope, look for stories that are hopeful, then I'm going to be seeking those out to make myself feel better. And for me, I've just reached a point where I don't feel like I really need to do that, right? I have other things that are motivating me to work every single day and to chip away at, creating change within our emergency management system. And so I think that's an important thing for people to hear. I think that there are some people who are really motivated by that hope, and thinking about hope for the future is what drives them into action every day. I think that there are also people who don't really need that to get work done. And I think when you hear kind of these broader conversations happening in climate spaces, a lot of times we get a little bit sidetracked by those stories about hope and kind of searching for those stories about hope. And again, because this is such an urgent issue, if you're not somebody who needs that, I think it's okay to say, you know what, I'm not going to spend my time dealing with that. I'm going to focus on these concrete actions that I feel like I have some influence or some control over, and try to push those forward.
Hurricane Katrina, top of mind. What went right? What went wrong?
What went right was, I think, the response from everyday Americans across the country. What went wrong was the government's response.
Diplomatically put. Okay, second one. Wildfires and drought in 2019, 2020. We're talking about California, Oregon, Washington, Australia.
Okay, I think what went right is, I think the wildland fire community is doing like incredible things. I spent some time out there this past summer in Oregon. They're working harder than anyone else anywhere in the country right now. So I think they're doing great. What went wrong? Complete failure of foresight across the board with drought conditions and what that means for the western half of the United States.
Yeah, and how do you change your activities based on the conditions, the actual environmental conditions? All right, third one, what they called snowpocalypse in the southeast U.S. 2014 timeframe.
Again, I would say the local response, I'm thinking of this was the one in Atlanta, right? Is that the one you're thinking of? Yeah.
Hmm.
So, people
Yeah.
going off the highways and kind of being able to spend the night at gas stations or whatever, right? That like emergency sheltering that spontaneously emerged. What went wrong? Probably government communication specifically with the public about what was happening and what resources were or were not available for them.
Okay, next one. Floods of the Carolinas 2015, 2019.
Was that what was 2019?
Well, that
Or
time
just like
period when they
Florence and
had
every
the consistent amount of flooding that was going on.
um I think actually okay. So what went well, I would say, is there is a lot of local community organizing surrounding mitigation in North and South Carolina, looking like small community groups working to influence mitigation policy and implement buyout programs and what else. And then what went wrong? Nothing necessarily stands out specifically. I think like just generic failure to kind of plan in the long term, thinking about how to, build communities sustainably.
Superstorm Sandy, 2012, New York, New Jersey.
Um, what went well? The group Occupy Sandy is always kind of front of mind in terms of community organizing to meet immediate needs. What did not go well? Um, um, I think there was kind of a lost chance with Sandy in the aftermath. I think that there was probably the political will to make broader national changes to our emergency management system because of the political weight that New York City has in the federal government. And there were some changes made, but I think we probably could have pushed things much further than we did.
All right, I'm going to get away from the natural disasters and I'm going to give you 9/11.
Well, the obvious thing for what went right was the evacuation of Lower Manhattan, the boat lift,
Mhm.
spontaneous evacuation. What went wrong? Well, I mean, probably the biggest thing that went wrong were in my opinion, the changes to the emergency management system across the board in the aftermath.
And so the reallocation of
Yeah, so the
under
like creation of
DHS and all that.
DHS, putting FEMA under DHS,
Yeah.
the like turning the emergency management system like upside down and backwards wasn't maybe the best move in retrospect.
Okay, last one. COVID-19.
Oh goodness. What?
This final chapter is not written yet, but just up to now.
Yeah. Okay, so let's see what went wrong. Well, I mean, the like complete breakdown of the U.S. public health and emergency management systems was probably pretty high up there in terms of what went wrong. What went well? I mean, again, I have to look at the local level, right? Communities that came together. If you think back to the very early days of, neighbors putting out like grocery signups to go get groceries for their elderly neighbors, and that kind of really, street level mutual aid that formed, I think is something to be proud of.
All right, I'm going to give you a bonus one, and it's what are we going to learn from Hurricane Ian?
Oh, good question. Well, I think there's like the cynical approach to this question, which is I don't necessarily know that we will learn very much from it. I think it's kind of hard to tell when you're still very much in the midst of those early days of recovery. But Hurricane Ian is going to fall among a very long line of hurricanes that we've had in recent years that have not led to any kinds of significant changes. I mean, I think one thing specifically coming out of certain parts of Florida is the importance of sending out evacuation orders, in some places where they weren't sent and should have been. So hopefully that is a concrete lesson that we can learn again for the future.
I think one of the most fascinating things that I've seen in the Hurricane Ian coverage is the unexpected water level. And when you look at like the docks and you look at the boats that are sitting, inland, like well inland, the fact that the dock pylons are still intact and the floating docks actually just popped off the top.
Mm-hmm.
And like the boats are still, the boats in a lot of cases were like still tied to the dock, just, in a whole totally different area. Samantha, as we close out, the Jedburghs had to do 3 things every day to be successful. They had to be able to shoot, they had to be able to move, they had to be able to communicate. These were foundations, habits, if you will. What are the 3 things that you do every day to set the conditions for success in your world?
So every day has to start with coffee, need caffeine. Secondly, I live or die by my to-do list. If it is not written on the to-do list, it's not happening. And then my third thing would be trying to be near the ocean at some point during the day, going for a walk. I'm very fortunate to teach in a classroom that's right next to the ocean, but any kind of proximity to the water is good for the soul.
I love those 3, and they resonate with me because I try to do those things every day as much as I can. But yeah, starts with coffee. Stick to the to-do list and be near the ocean. There's a healing power, a healing effect of the ocean. And I talk about it all the time. You got to get out there and be in nature. We talk about these 9 characteristics of elite performance used by Special Operations Command to recruit, assess, and develop talent, drive, resiliency, adaptability, humility, integrity, curiosity, team ability, effective intelligence, and emotional strength. To be an elite performer, you're going to demonstrate all 9 of these at different times, not necessarily all at one time. You can't. But based on the situation that you're in, you're going to have a couple of them. Great organizations, they think about what they need and what they need their leaders to demonstrate when they put them in certain situations, and that's how they recruit and assess their talent. I say that because at the end of these, I take one and I think about our conversation and I think about you and what you exemplify on a daily basis. And to me, that's resiliency. Resiliency is defined as our ability to bounce back, to return after we've experienced an event. But resiliency doesn't begin when the event occurs. Resiliency starts in preparation. It starts well before the event occurs. And our ability to be resilient as people, as teams, as organizations, all comes down to what we talk about every time we get on this podcast. The tagline of the podcast, how you prepare today determines success tomorrow. Did we think about it? Are we ready? Have we prepared the right way, tactically and strategically? It comes down to being an effective thought leader. You're one of the foremost thought leaders in emergency management. You're continuing to set the example every day in everything that you're doing. Disasterology was a great read, bringing to light all of the strategic through tactical level things that we can do as individuals and organizations, and the socio-economic challenges that we face in climate change and emergency management. I thank you so much for spending some time with me tonight, telling this story, and I look forward to more great things to come.
Thanks for having me.
American Jedburghs went out to form the foundation of the United States Special Forces and the Special Activities Director to the Central Intelligence Agency. Thanks for listening to the Jedburgh Podcast. I'm your creator and host, Fran Racioppi. Join us next week for a new episode on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Check us out on YouTube for full episodes, highlights, and other behind-the-scenes content. If you like what you heard, give us a like and leave a review. Follow me, Fran Racioppi, Talent War Group, and our sponsor Jersey Mike Subs on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. Send your comments and inquiries to media@talentwargroup.com. As a former member of Special Forces, the Jedburgh podcast donates a percentage of all proceeds to the Green Beret Foundation, supporting America's Special Forces and their families. Thanks for joining us on this episode. How you prepare today determines success tomorrow.